I bought a house, but my family expected me to house my sister's family for free. I refused, cut them off, and I'm moving to London. I, 35F, work as an investment analyst and am pretty successful in my job. Growing up with an older sister, Victoria, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the first realized early on that if I wanted something, I had to work for it myself. From the start, our parents' treatment of us was noticeably different. When Victoria turned 16, she received a nice new Volkswagen Beetle with a large red bow on top. When it was my turn, I got Dad's ancient Honda, which had 150,000 miles and a tendency to break down. Victoria has always been the ideal child in our parents' eyes. She was the beautiful one, the social butterfly, the one who couldn't do anything wrong. She married her husband, Nathan, 39 million, right after graduation, and they quickly began having children. They currently have 3, Charlotte, 8 Flyclay, 5M and Drew, 2M. They live in a rental flat, which Victoria frequently complains about. Meanwhile, I have been more fortunate in my own way. My best friend's parents own numerous properties and have been renting me a wonderful one-bedroom apartment at half of the market rate for the last 5 years. They trust me because I've never given them any reason not to. While Victoria had everything handed to her, I learned to be cautious with money. Since I began working, I've been saving diligently by living within my means, cooking at home rather than eating out, and taking public transportation whenever possible. My coworkers frequently mock me for being overly frugal, but I had a plan. College provided another striking evidence of inequity. Victoria attended her ideal school with our parents, covering all expenses, including tuition, lodging and board, and a hefty monthly allowance. Meanwhile, throughout my final year of high school, I applied for every scholarship I could find, staying up late to maintain my perfect GPA, knowing that it was my last chance at higher study. With remote work becoming more widespread at my company, I just need to come into the office for key meetings. A tranquil country cottage seemed ideal. Last week, I finally opened my savings account and examined the data. After years of diligent planning and saving, I had enough to make a down payment on a small home. I was in the middle of looking through real estate listings when my mother called, with her usual impeccable timing. "Don't forget, we're expecting you for dinner on Saturday," she added, her voice carrying a subtle order disguised as a reminder. "Victoria and Nathan are coming with the kids. And please try to be on time for once." I arrived at my parents' suburban home at precisely 05:05 p.m. that Saturday. Their driveway was already full with Victoria's minivan, so I had to park on the street. Inside, there was the usual chaos. Kids running around, my mother fussing over everyone as if it were a state supper rather than our typical family meeting. My father had already retired into his usual recliner with his newspaper, where he would remain until supper was served. The traditional dinner complaint circulated. Nathan complains about his demanding supervisor and difficult project deadlines. Victoria laments their tight flat and the children's constant demands. Dad expressed concerns about the economy and gas prices. Mom frequently adds to the commotion by commenting on everyone's eating habits and portion amounts. During these evenings, I mastered the art of mental escape. I took advantage of the hubbub by checking my phone under the table and scrolling through a lovely small home I had discovered. 2 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a stunning garden. The pricing was within my budget. The listing images depicted a beautiful wrap-around porch, ideal for a set of rocking chairs. The prospect of sitting there with my morning coffee made me happy. "What's so interesting on that phone? You barely touched your food." Mom's piercing voice broke through the background commotion. Her hawk-like eyes never skipped a beat, despite the commotion. I could have made something up about work, but perhaps the warmth of the fantasy still lingering in my head compelled me to be honest. "Actually, I'm looking at houses. I'm thinking about buying one soon." The silence that followed was terrible. You could hear the ice cubes settling in the water cups. Even the children realized something had changed. Charlotte paused in the middle of a conversation about her school performance. Lucas halted, fork halfway to his mouth. Even tiny Andrew stopped slamming his spoon against his high chair. Victoria's head shot up so quickly that I worried she could suffer whiplash. Nathan's incessant rants about his boss ended in mid-sentence. Mom's hand paused in the middle of reaching for the salt shaker. Dad's newspaper descended gently, like a curtain, showing his astonished expression. Buy a house? Mom asked, as if she hadn't heard me right. You? Well, yes, I admitted, immediately regretting my candor. The way they all looked at me made me feel like I had announced plans to invade Mars. I'm just looking at options right now. Nothing definite. What kind of house? Victoria said, her voice retaining the strangely pointed tone she used when she felt frightened. It was the same tone she used when I received a higher SAT score than she did, just before convincing our parents that I had cheated. I haven't really decided yet, I answered ambiguously, attempting to change the conversation. But I could sense their minds working, unspoken thoughts nearly palpable in the air. My parents exchanged profound looks, the type they'd honed over decades of marriage. Victoria kept looking at Nathan, who had suddenly become quite interested in his mashed potatoes. The typical supper bustle soon resumed, but something had changed. The talk felt forced, as if players had forgotten their lines and were desperately trying to finish the show. Even the children appeared to pick up on the stress, and their usual loud demeanor subsided. A week later, my phone began to vibrate with Mom's calls during an important Zoom conference. After her third effort, I called back during my lunch break, expecting an emergency. Finally, Mom said, her voice practically trembling from joy. I found the perfect house for you. Martha from church informed her of a listing in her neighborhood. It's absolutely ideal. I sat down my half-eaten lunch, immediately felt a headache forming. Mom, I haven't even asked for help finding a house. But she was now in full stride and unable to halt. It has 5 bedrooms. No, 6. The master bedroom is huge, and there are these adorable children's rooms with built-in closets. I blinked. Oh, and the backyard. There's already a playground installed. Can you believe it? And the location is just perfect. Walking distance to St. Mary's Elementary School and the public library. I stroked my temples, trying to remain cool. Mom, I appreciate you thinking of me, but that's not what I'm looking for at all. I want a small country house, something cozy just for me. I don't need multiple children's rooms or a playground. Don't be ridiculous, she yelled, her delight quickly turning into frustration. You can't just think about yourself, you need to plan ahead. This house is perfect. Martha says the owners are motivated to sell quickly. After she hung up, Victoria began sending out an endless stream of postings for large family houses. Each subsequent message delivered another 4 to 6 bedroom house with numerous baths, large yards, and close proximity to schools and parks. By the 20th message, I had stopped checking. It was evident that they weren't listening to what I really wanted. Instead, I contacted Amanda Cha, a realtor with glowing recommendations. During our first encounter, I was struck by how well she listened. I want something small and cozy, I explained. A country house, not too far from the city, with good internet for remote work. Maybe a small garden where I could grow herbs and vegetables. When I told her about my pricing range, her eyes brightened up. I think I might have exactly what you're looking for. It just came on the market yesterday. The house she showed me was ideal. A lovely 2-bedroom cottage located 40 minutes from the city. White siding, dark green shutters, a wrap-around porch with room for rocking chairs. Sunlight poured in via huge windows onto an open-plan living room. The kitchen was not large, but it had been redone with butcher block worktops and modern appliances. A wood-burning fireplace dominated the living room wall, and I could envision nice winter days spent reading beside it. Upstairs, there were 2 modest bedrooms and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, which I fell in love with right away. But the sunroom sealed the deal. There are windows on 3 sides that view a well-kept garden with raised beds and a small greenhouse. I could immediately envision myself spending weekends there, surrounded by greenery and natural light. The owner offered a quick closing discount, and I accepted without hesitation. The following few weeks were a blur of paperwork and preparation. I put down a larger down payment than was required, keeping the monthly payments manageable, using the money I had carefully saved all these years. While my family undoubtedly believed I was being cheap, I was actually building my future. After everything was finalized, I planned to announce the news at the next family dinner. Mom had just started discussing another house. Barbara next door is selling. She'll give us, you, a good price. Actually, I interrupted, unable to suppress my joy, despite their past attempts to sway my decision. I've already bought a house. The hush was absolute. Even Charlotte, who is normally unstoppable, paused in mid-motion. I took a big breath and began detailing my new house, my voice full of enthusiasm, despite the mounting tension around the table. It's this beautiful cottage, about 40 minutes outside the city, 2 bedrooms, the most amazing sunroom, and there's even a small greenhouse in the backyard. The previous owner had these gorgeous raised garden beds. My father's fist hit the table with such power that the water glasses jumped. "Are you out of your mind?" he exclaimed. I had never seen him that angry before. Andrew burst into tears as he heard the startling boom. "How dare you buy a house without consulting us first?" My mother's cheeks had turned an alarming red. "After all those perfect family homes we found? Why would I need to consult you about buying my own house with my own money?" I inquired, feeling as if I had wandered into some strange parallel dimension. "Because we had it all planned out." Mom practically screamed. "Barbara's house would have been perfect, right here in the neighborhood. Plenty of room for everyone." "Room for everyone?" I asked slowly, growing confused. "It's just going to be me living there." The hush that ensued was deafening. Mom and Dad exchanged glances as Victoria sat there with an unusually serene demeanor. Nathan was suddenly quite interested in his plate. "Actually," Mom explained in a tone that made my blood run cold, "the plan was for Victoria, Nathan, and the kids to live there with you." I waited for the punchline. It didn't arrive. Victoria nodded, as if everything was totally normal. "We're so cramped in that apartment. Your house would give us all the space we need, and since we wouldn't have to pay rent or utilities, we could finally start saving money." I gazed about at their dead, serious expressions. Dad's severe condemnation, Mom's righteous rage, Victoria's entitled expectation, Nathan's awkward avoidance. Years of memories flowed back. Every time, Victoria got what she wanted, while I worked twice as hard for half the pay. Every time, my successes were ignored, while her slightest achievements were praised. "You all just assumed I would buy a house for Victoria's family to live in?" "Well, of course." Mom threw out her hands as if I was being intentionally cryptic. "That's what family does. This isn't helping. This is expecting me to house 5 people without even asking me." "You're being selfish," Victoria shouted, her cool demeanor breaking. "The kids have to share rooms. Andrew's crib is in our bedroom. It's not fair to them. You need to cancel this ridiculous purchase immediately," Mom commanded, her voice harsh with the control she had exercised over me for 35 years. "Barbara's house is perfect, right in the neighborhood." "No." I stood up, scraping my chair against the floor. The word came out stronger than I expected, bearing the weight of decades of pent-up rage. Chaos erupted. Mom jumped up and waved her arms. Dad's voice roared. The children started crying. "But we'll be so cramped," Victoria moaned, "like if I hadn't said anything. Charlotte has ballet. Lucas has soccer. You're not going to be cramped anywhere, because you're not living in my house," I said calmly. "None of you are, ever. Is that clear enough for you?" They stared at me as if I had a second head. The entitled shock on their faces was nearly amusing. "How can you be so cruel to your own sister?" Mom asked, clutching her pearls and her voice shaking with wrath. I grabbed my handbag and walked towards the door, their shouts rising behind me in a cacophony of demands and accusations. I couldn't hear another word. I got in my car and drove home in a haze, their entitled expectations still echoing in my ears. Update 1. The aggressive knocking on my flat door began as I was packing the kitchen. The coffee mug I was wrapped in newspaper slid from my grasp, but landed safely on a mound of packing paper. "Open this door right now." My father's voice rang through the wood. "We know you're in there." I froze, bubble wrap still in my fingers. More thumping ensued. "Go away," I yelled back. "I'm not discussing this anymore. Don't you dare talk to us like that." Dad's fist caused the door to rattle in its frame. "We raised you better than this?" My hands trembled as I took up the phone. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police, I mean it. I pulled up the keypad and purposefully pushed digits, ensuring that they could hear the beeping. I'm dialing right now. Dad's curse was broken by Mom's sudden intake of air. We're leaving. Mom's voice had become as icy as ice. But this isn't over. You're making a terrible mistake. I slid down against the wall, my heart thumping, after hearing their footsteps disappear down the corridor. An hour later, Victoria sent the first message, which included a photo of Charlotte and Lucas squished together on their shared bunk bed. Look how little space they have, the caption stated. Charlotte can't even have a desk for homework. When I didn't answer, another photo appeared. Andrew's crib squeezed into the corner of Victoria and Nathan's room. He wakes up every time we come to bed. This isn't fair to him. As I continued to ignore her, Victoria's communications became increasingly hostile. They began arriving at all hours, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., and 6 a.m. You always were Dad's least favorite. Mom cries herself to sleep because of you. I hope you're happy all alone in that big house, while your nieces and nephews suffer. I blocked her phone number, then her Facebook, then her Instagram. But she kept finding new ways to contact me, setting up new accounts, using Nathan's phone, and even inventing false email addresses. The phone calls began to come from different directions. First, there was Aunt Marie. Sweetie, I just heard what's happening with your sister. Surely you can find it in your heart to help family. Uncle Bob was next. Kid, you need to think about what really matters here. Family comes first. Susan is my mother's dearest friend. Your mother is devastated. How could you do this to your own family? Even my former high school teacher, Mrs. Peterson, whom my mother still saw at church. I always thought you were such a kind student. I'm so disappointed to hear about this situation with your sister. They all sent the same message. I was selfish, heartless, cruel. I should give up my home, my goals, and my independence to help Victoria. None of them seemed to wonder why Victoria's living predicament was my concern. After 2 weeks of incessant pestering, I'd had it. I went to my cell carrier and changed my phone number, giving it solely to my employer and a few trustworthy pals who had not chosen sides in this fiasco. Moving day was blissfully quiet. I chose a moving firm I'd never used before, ensuring that my relatives couldn't track my address using common local services. The movers worked quickly and professionally, and by dusk, I was standing in my new living room, surrounded by boxes and possibilities. That first night at my cottage, I sat on my veranda with a cup of tea, listening to the crickets and watching the stars appear. There's no traffic noise, no sirens, there's no family turmoil, just peace. I felt something inside me suddenly relax, a tightness I hadn't realized I'd been lugging around for years. I occasionally check their social media updates. Victoria posts passive-aggressive status messages about family betrayal and selfish siblings. Mom's barely veiled posts about ungrateful children and family obligations. Relatives and family friends made comments, everyone taking sides without understanding the whole tale. But here's the thing. None of it concerns me anymore. Their comments can't reach me in my new refuge. I turned the second bedroom into a home office, positioning my monitors to face the window so I can watch birds visit the feeder I erected. The previous owner's raised garden beds are currently overflowing with herbs and vegetables. My first try at gardening was surprisingly successful. For the first time in my life, I am living fully on my own terms. And it feels really liberated. Update 2. Something unexpected occurred today. Remember the large investment project I've been working on remotely from my new home? It paid out hugely. My manager summoned me to a virtual meeting to inform me that I had not only received a significant bonus, but was also being considered for a director job. My new environment's quiet and focus had enabled me to excel at work in ways I had never believed possible. Without regular family interruptions and emotional exhaustion, I found myself proposing new ideas and taking on leadership roles naturally. This triumph, however, resulted in an interesting development. Victoria's apartment complex was sold to a developer who intends to transform it into luxury condominiums. All tenants received eviction notifications with a 60-day notice to vacate. I learned from family members that Victoria and Nathan were having difficulty finding a new place that fit their budget. The timing could not have been better. My promotion comes with a large salary boost, and I chose to utilize my bonus to make down payment on a lovely holiday home in the mountains. It's essentially an investment as property values in that neighborhood have skyrocketed. Today, I received a well-phrased email from Nathan, not Victoria, interestingly enough. He described their predicament and asked if I would like to negotiate housing arrangements again. The old me may have felt guilty. Despite everything, I could have considered helping, but I simply gave them some local apartment listings that fit their budget and wished them luck in their quest. Mom took a different approach. She showed up in my workplace building. I suppose she got the address from LinkedIn. With tears in her eyes, she described how she and her father were suffering with their retirement money and had always relied on the family sticking together to help each other in their golden years. I listened politely. Then I stated that my financial advisor had advised against combining family and financial commitments. Her face turned a familiar shade of red, but this time, in the professional setting of my company lobby, she couldn't cause a fuss. The family's social media campaign has taken a unique turn. They are now writing about wealthy people who have lost touch with their roots, as well as stories on toxic individualism in modern society. My aunt even wrote a lengthy Facebook post about how money can transform people, to which hundreds of people responded sympathetically. But they are unaware that my accomplishment has drawn the attention of headhunters. Several famous firms, including one in Europe, have expressed interest in hiring me. The idea of putting an ocean between myself and this drama is getting more enticing. Meanwhile, my new greenhouse is flourishing. I've started growing exotic orchids, which are delicate and require time and attention to detail, similar to creating a job or limits. I'm discovering that the most satisfying experiences in life require time and effort to cultivate. I joined a local gardening group, which has become a fantastic source of camaraderie. These people have no idea about my family issues. They just know me as the woman who brings homegrown herbs to meetings and asks in-depth questions about soil pH. It's refreshing to be judged entirely on who I am, rather than my willingness to give up my life for the sake of others' convenience. Yesterday, I held my first dinner party in my new house. Colleagues, gardening friends, and neighbors gathered at my dining table to share wonderful food and conversation. No one asked anything from me, except possibly the recipe for my herb-crusted salmon. The evening was filled with laughter, intelligent conversation, and mutual respect. All of the things that family gatherings should be but never are. As I watched my visitors have fun on the porch and fireflies dance in the yard beyond, I realized something important. I haven't simply purchased a house. I've built a life that is totally my own, free of the burden of others' expectations and entitlements. Allow them to submit their passive-aggressive messages. Let them discuss family duty and obligation. I'm too busy thriving to worry. Update 3. The last elements of my win fell into place today. Victoria and Nathan were unable to acquire a new apartment. Their credit check found some alarming findings. They're currently temporarily residing with our parents, with all 3 kids squeezed into the guest room. Meanwhile, I received an official offer for the director post in our London office. The remuneration package is outstanding, including a lovely, company-provided flat in Kensington. When I announced my acceptance on LinkedIn, professional congrats flooded in. The contrast between my colleagues' sincere support and my family's harsh silence was startling. The most rewarding moment was when Dad called. His voice lacked the usual authority. He began by casually asking about this London foolishness, but it soon became evident why he was calling. The recent market slump has significantly reduced their retirement savings. They'd reportedly planned to sell their home and move in with Victoria's family in the house they anticipated me to buy. We always assumed we'd all be together, he added, his voice unusually shaky. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger. I stayed professional and detached, offering a great financial advisor I know. She specializes in retirement planning for seniors. I'll email you her contact information. My family is unaware that I have already made arrangements to manage my mountain home as a premium vacation rental. The predicted income is impressive, more than enough to pay Victoria's whole monthly rent. Strangely, but it is not information I intend to convey. Today I held a farewell garden party for my local friends. The greenhouse was in full flower, with orchids providing a beautiful backdrop. As I watched my visitors have fun, someone commented on how much I've changed since moving here, how I appear more confident and at ease. Later that evening, while packing for London, I discovered an old photo album. There was a photo of teenage Victoria receiving her brand new Volkswagen, and I was standing in the background next to Dad's ancient Honda. The recollection no longer stings. Instead, it makes me realize how far I've come. I am retaining my rustic cottage. It will be my getaway when I visit the United States. The garden will be maintained by a nice retired couple from my gardening group, while the house will remain my sanctuary, free of family strife. Tomorrow, I'll board a flight to London. My family does not yet know. They will find out when they see my social media posts from Hyde Park or along the Thames. Victoria will probably write about sisters who desert their families. Mom will share articles on expats who regret abandoning their loved ones. But sitting here in my sunroom one final time before my early morning journey, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant colors, I feel nothing but peace. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning the battle, but choosing to leave the battlefield entirely. Allow them to deal with their cramped living conditions and financial challenges. I'll be too busy enjoying my new life in London to read their social media updates. Sometimes the best retaliation is simply living well. I stopped having sex with my wife unless she was sober, and now we're stuck in a loveless, roommate-like marriage, unsure of our future. My wife, 35, and I, 35M, have been married for 15 years and together for 20. We have 2 children, ages 12 and 14, whom we adore, and we try constantly to provide them with the greatest possible life. Things have been difficult over the last 3 years. I recognize that our children take a lot of our time and resources with school, band, sports, and extracurricular activities. I am aware of the toll it may have on marriages. However, for the last 3 years, my wife and I have had very little closeness or intercourse. We've been attempting to work on that aspect of our relationship, but the last year has been the most difficult. By far the darkest year of our marriage. We seldom spoke and eventually became roommates, co-parenting under the same home. It was gloomy and discouraging, prompting us to consider divorce. Things became so dark that the entire home turned dismal. We sought aid through individual and couples therapy, which seemed to improve gradually. We began having in-depth conversations about what our marriage looked like and what we hoped it could be. Then things got tougher. My wife told me she was no longer in love with me, but simply saw me as a best friend and loved me in a platonic way. This absence of romantic love was one of the reasons she did not want closeness or sex. I was astonished and devastated. I grew angry and unhappy, unable to understand why the person I loved no longer wanted or desired me. Things deteriorated again, and we were back at square one. One afternoon, I had a heart-to-heart with her, asking where the source of the problem was. Her reaction was, "I don't know." She admitted to harboring animosity against me, but couldn't pinpoint the source. This provided little information into how to fix things, leaving me perplexed and frustrated. We've gotten to the point where she claims she has no sex drive or desire for intimacy. She claims she only wants companionship, implying a co-parenting roommate dynamic. I asked her what I could do or what made me unappealing, and her response was invariably, "I don't know." She admits to loving me, but it isn't the same. She's felt isolated for years, and marriage seems like too much work. Her primary emphasis is on the children, and my efforts as a co-parent are important to her. I'm at a loss and simply voicing my frustration. It's difficult to accept that the person you love no longer cares about you. I feel as if I'm only here to give financially and as a parent. When she talks about companionship, it appears that she is content with having a nice father for the children and my financial assistance. She has told me that she has no interest in intimacy and does not want it right now. She stated that the only way she could have sex was if she was intoxicated, which I find abhorrent and unacceptable. I told her I wouldn't be a part of that. because forcing herself into intimacy with booze or drugs is unhealthy. To my surprise, this angered her and made her more aloof. Despite this, we are both very honest and open. We have never cheated, and we have full access to each other's phones, emails, and social media. But we rarely check. I inquired whether there was anyone else, and she denied it, which I trust. We gently searched each other's belongings, and, as predicted, found nothing untoward. We've always been forthright, even about difficult things, so I don't suspect any wrongdoing or cheating. Is it wrong for me to decline sex when she's intoxicated? I'm solid in my viewpoint since drunk or high sex does not sit well with me. I have no idea how to help our position, and I am feeling increasingly frightened and frantic. We're both fairly young, healthy, and attractive. We both have stable employment and are excellent parents. I'm not sure how our lives brought us to this point. I'd appreciate some outside perspective and advice on how to handle something like this. It feels terrible to be unwanted and undesirable by my own husband. I despise it. We did some swinging in the past, which was enjoyable for a bit. We agreed to stop and have determined that it is no longer a factor. When we were swinging, our marriage appeared to be in good condition. We informed our couple's therapist to ensure that we were not overlooking a potential problem. I asked my wife if our swinging experience had changed her opinion of our relationship, but she responded no. Our swinging was always done together, and it was entirely sex-based with no emotional or polyamorous elements. I believe her because she has always been upfront and honest, even when it is uncomfortable. Swinging was her idea, not mine, and I trust her when she says it's no longer an issue. It could be something she needs to discuss further with her therapist or during our couple's treatment. Update 1. The term resentment has long been a central element in therapy. It's been eating me up inside, especially since my wife keeps telling me she has no idea why she is bitter or what's bothering her emotionally. I brought this up again with our therapist, and we spoke about how we'd been together for 15 years, married since we were 14 years old. We grew up together and welcomed our first child when she was 19, and I was 20. That dramatically altered the trajectory of our life. We lived in extreme poverty and faced several difficulties with little social life over the past decade, since we were too preoccupied with raising children. Our children, now 12 and 14, took up all of our attention. The therapist asked my wife a lot of questions about her emotions, and 90% of her answers were about the kids. It felt like she was reluctant to say how bad things were at times, because she may feel guilty or ashamed, as if it meant she regretted having children. I brought this up during the session, and the therapist pushed her to look at things from a more personal perspective, rather than just as a mother. This was an eye-opener. My wife stated that she was frustrated that we had lost out on so many life events. She was clear, though, that she didn't miss out on other relationships, dating or partying. But she did feel like she had lost all of her friends. This was huge, as one of the most difficult aspects of our lives has been how secluded we've grown while raising children. I reminded her of the importance of friendships and how she should prioritize herself and her social relationships. For the past 3 years, we've talked about the importance of friendships, particularly with peers who can help us negotiate life's problems or just provide us joy. My wife always avoids this, despite her desire for external stimuli. Her children have always been the reason she hasn't invested in friendships or herself. At this point in the conversation, it was evident that many of her complaints were related to the children. I inquired whether she was upset with me because I got her pregnant so young, and she responded no. She admitted that it was illogical to blame me because it takes two to tango. I saw this as progress since it provided us with something to work on. We agreed to devote more time to nurturing friendships, both jointly and individually. Toward the end of the session, we addressed next moves. It was still unknown what would happen. I was forthright in asking my wife what her plans were. I had decided before the session that if she insisted on the co-parenting roommate scenario, I would turn 180 degrees and focus on myself. She essentially repeated the same thing. She doesn't want closeness or sex with me right now, but she loves me and feels horrible about not being there for me. As I said in my initial post, I brought up the brief swinging encounter. and she assured me that it was not an issue. I agree with her. It was a mechanical solution to a problem that did not exist at the time. We tried it, agreed to quit, and went on. I also mentioned additional life situations that could have produced animosity, but we didn't make much progress in determining the fundamental cause, which was frustrating. I immediately told my wife that I would not be okay with the arrangement. I informed her that I had done everything I could and that this matter no longer involved me or required any more action on my side. I was quite clear that I would not tolerate this dynamic and that I needed to be with someone who actively participated in our marriage, worked toward resolutions, and was interested in sustaining an intimate and sexual relationship. I made it plain that I was not going to be a convenience or just a roommate and co-parent. I told her that I loved her and wanted this to work, but that I would only stay committed to the marriage if she was as devoted. If she wasn't, I wouldn't continue in a relationship where my efforts weren't appreciated. I assured her that I had no plans to leave or seek a divorce, but if this dynamic persisted, divorce was unavoidable. Of course, there were tears, and the session ended on a gloomy, unhappy note. Nothing was addressed, and I left feeling discouraged, determined to begin the 180 approach as soon as possible. The 180 method necessitates maintaining distance, while remaining cold and transactional, which is unpleasant, especially since this dynamic was already chilly and transactional. I started following the 180 tactics the same day, informing my wife that I would respect the roommate and co-parent dynamic without complaint, but she should know that I wasn't happy and would never be okay with it. I also told her that if she didn't want to put in the effort, I would stop working on it. She agreed and retired to bed. I began establishing distance, focused on myself, and keeping conversations brief and transactional. When she requested for assistance with personal matters, I declined, which surprised her. She was outraged, accusing me of being juvenile, but I emphasized that she was now accountable for her own life and difficulties. We didn't talk much during the next 3 days, just when absolutely necessary. During this time, she grew visibly concerned and stressed, but I resisted my natural want to console and assist her. She cried one night, telling me she was stressed and worried about me because of my indifference. I reminded her calmly that she had chosen this dynamic and that I too was taking care of myself. It's been difficult to be cold and distant since, as I've indicated, I adore her and want to touch and console her. However, I knew this could be manipulation on her part to keep me in the friend zone, so I remained the course. Now, a week into the 180 method, I've noticed a lot of changes on her end. I believe she is coming to realize that I am more than just a co-parent and buddy. A few days ago, I texted her a bill breakdown and a 50-50th split on our financial responsibility. She was enraged, calling it out of left field. I said that friends split everything 50-50th, and as her friend, I expected the same. This made me realize how much I'd been taken for granted. Her pleasure and convenience had been at my expense. I pushed on, reminding her that this was the dynamic she had requested, and that it was still a good deal because she would have to fund 100% of everything if she were on her own. To summarize, while the 180 method has proven effective in many aspects, I remain concerned about the entire issue. There have been numerous eye-opening experiences, some of which have been difficult to confront. However, it has generated renewed energy and attempts on her part. She's talking to me more, and while it's difficult to say no, I hope this continues as things improve. I've also seen that she's making more time for herself outside of motherhood, which is significant given that she neglected herself for many years. I'm glad to see her become more like herself again. My goal is that, as we work on ourselves, our marriage will improve. It's impossible to predict where this will go from here. We remain courteous and friendly, which is a positive indication. Boundaries are established, and expectations are extremely apparent. Whatever the conclusion, I will be satisfied with everything that has been accomplished. We will continue with couples therapy until we either reignite our marriage or divorce. A non-biased third party serves as a witness and advisor during this process. No matter what, I will always love my wife, but I will not participate in a sexless, intimacy-free marriage because we deserve more. My family is constantly comparing me to my successful cousin, and I've reached my breaking point. I'm a 30-year-old freelance graphic designer, and this year's Thanksgiving was a total mess. My family gets together every year, and my cousin Kevin's name always comes up. The way they talk about him makes you think he walks on water. Kevin works as a corporate lawyer and is the family's golden boy. He's tall, always well-dressed, drives a fancy car, and embodies almost every success stereotype that my family holds dear. Meanwhile, I'm just the person doing the art projects. This year, it began before Kevin arrived. We were sitting at the dinner table, and my mother made the first statement as soon as the food hit the plates. She did not waste any time. Kevin really has his life together, doesn't he? She asked, staring at me as if I should nod and agree. I just kept my head down and focused on the mashed potatoes. My freelance business has been doing well lately, yet none of them cares. All they see is that I don't make 6 figures in some high-powered profession, and that's all that matters to them. The night carried on, and the subject kept returning to Kevin. My aunts and uncles would not quit talking about him. Have you heard? Kevin's firm is preparing him for partnership. Alternatively, and he just returned from a Maldives trip. It's as if they are enamored with him. I've learned to keep silent over the years. There's no point in trying to steer the topic when everything points to my cousin. But this year seemed different. I'm not sure why, but something inside me couldn't take it anymore. As if on cue, Kevin made his spectacular appearance. He arrived late, of course, and the instant he went through the door, all eyes were on him. He walked in, flashing the keys to his new sports car, like he was the star of a reality show. Everyone came up to greet him. I remained sitting, observing on the sidelines as they virtually fawned over him. Nobody cared to ask me about my life or my job. I just secured a very great freelance gig with a popular independent brand. Yet, it was as if I didn't exist. Then came the kicker. During supper, my mother leaned over and remarked, maybe if you had stuck to a more stable career, you could afford a place like Kevin's. I could feel my hands tightening into fists beneath the table. I didn't say anything, but my insides were boiling. It wasn't just one comment, it was years of hearing the same story. I understand what they think. Kevin is the success story, and I'm the guy who could have done more. But here's the thing. Kevin's life is not flawless. He's unhappy at his high-stress work, and I know he's been in more failed relationships than I can count. He's told me before about how lonely he is, but none of this matters to the family. They just see the surface, and they believe he has it all. Knowing this does not assist, however. Even while I understand his hardships, I can't shake the notion that I'm constantly in his shadow. Then my uncle joined in. He leaned down half joking. You know, Kevin could probably get you a job at his company. Maybe it's time to get serious about work, right? I tried to chuckle, but inside I felt like I was going to burst. It's as if they don't see me. I've developed a successful career, yet they don't consider it true work. They simply cannot respect it. After dinner, I found myself drinking more than I normally would. Everyone moved into the living room where the talk naturally turned back to Kevin. They discussed his recent promotion, his new automobile, and the vacation he just enjoyed. I tried to join in at one point, casually mentioning the freelancing job I'd been working on. But before I could finish, my aunt interrupted to tell me that Kevin's firm is sending him to Europe for a large case. I felt invisible. That's when the memories came pouring back. Growing up, the story was always the same. Kevin was the kid I was always compared to at school activities, family holidays, and even birthday celebrations. It was always, look at Kevin, isn't he amazing? Meanwhile, I was only there as the other cousin. I'm not sure what came over me, but I couldn't be silent any longer. When I eventually spoke up, the room became quiet. I said something like, you people know I have my own life, right? It may not be a well-paying corporate position, but it makes me happy. The room lapsed into an uneasy quiet. My mother gave me the look that suggests she's disappointed without saying anything. No one knew what to say. Of course. Kevin, as the golden child, attempted to smooth things over. He smiled and complimented my creative work, but it did not feel real. It seemed patronizing. That was when I snapped. I responded, thanks, but I don't need validation from someone who doesn't even know what happiness is. You could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was stunned. Nobody had ever spoken to Kevin like way, especially not me. My father swiftly drew me aside, muttering that I was causing a commotion, but I didn't care anymore. I was finished pretending everything was good. Without saying anything else, I grabbed my coat and walked out. I couldn't stand being in that house anymore. I was fed up with the continual comparisons and the sense of never being good enough. As soon as I arrived home, I opened Reddit and Vinay. I blogged about everything. How I'd been compared to Kevin my entire life. How Thanksgiving was the final straw. And how I was tired of being treated as if I didn't exist. The post received thousands of upvotes and hundreds of comments. People from all over shared their own family comparison stories. And I felt less alone than I had in a long time. Late that night, I received a text from Kevin. I saw your post. We need to talk. My phone was constantly buzzing the morning after Thanksgiving. At first, I didn't even look into it. I knew what it was. After my Reddit article went viral, I expected some family members to see it, and they did. It was a mixed bag. Some responses were sympathetic, while others were filled with wrath. My aunt left a lengthy voicemail, unhappy that I had discussed intimate family affairs in public. Another cousin, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, sent me a message stating, I understand. I have been there. That one startled me. Then came the message I had been dreading from my mother. Her call arrived at 10 a.m., and I could already imagine what the talk would be like. I let it ring for a while before picking up. She did not hold back. She was unhappy that I had posted our family business online, and she demanded that I apologize to Kevin for embarrassing him in front of everyone. It was all the typical stuff, like how I needed to set things right and correct what I'd done. This time, though, things were different. I refused to cave. I refused to apologize, even after years of quietly living with the repeated comparisons. I made it apparent that I was over pretending things were good, and if they couldn't accept me for who I was, I'd have to walk away. She was quiet for a time, perhaps not expecting me to stand firm like that. However, the call ended with her expressing her disappointment in me. It pained, but I understood what had to happen. Later that night, Kevin called me. I wasn't sure what to expect, perhaps another lecture or some passive-aggressive attempt to smooth things over. But Kevin simply wanted to chat. I almost did not pick up. A part of me wanted to just ignore him, but curiosity got the best of me. I responded, and after a brief awkward chat, we decided to meet the next day at a local coffee shop. When I arrived, Kevin was already sitting at a table by the window, looking slightly less put together than normal. He wasn't dressed sharply, just a hoodie and pants, which was unusual for him. I sat down, and after a few moments of small conversation, he got to the point. He apologized. He stated he had no idea how much the family's continual comparisons had influenced me. I nodded, but I didn't entirely believe it. I figured he must be aware on some level. He'd always been the golden child, and I assumed he appreciated it, even if he didn't acknowledge it out loud. But then he said something that took me off guard. He complained about his profession, including the hard hours, constant pressure, and the fact that his parents prioritized his career over his happiness. It was eating him up. He even admitted that he had been considering quitting for a long time, but didn't know how to tell his family. He informed me that all the acclaim and attention he received didn't make him happy. In reality, it only made him feel more imprisoned. I just sat there, stunned. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. I used to believe he enjoyed the attention, but after hearing him speak, I understood he too was frustrated. Just like me. We began talking more openly than ever before about how much pressure we both felt from our families. I told him how being compared to him my entire life had made me feel invisible, as if nothing I accomplished could ever measure up. Surprisingly, he said he envied me. He stated he wished he had the bravery to follow something he was passionate about, as I was with my design job. But he felt too constrained by the expectations placed on him. Then he dropped the bomb. He intended to quit his work and travel for a year to figure out what he truly wanted in life. I wasn't sure what to say. We were talking about Kevin, the guy who had everything, and now he was telling me he was about to throw it all away to go trekking or whatever. Part of me was stunned, but another part of me admired him for it. It required courage to walk away from a profession like his, especially because his entire family had been rooting for him for years. When he eventually told the family about his plan, everything went as expected. The same relatives who had been praising his praises only days before were now full of criticism. How could you throw away such a bright career? How about your future? It felt weird to watch. All of their admiration for him was disintegrating before my eyes. I couldn't help but feel satisfied. For once, Kevin wasn't being treated as if he were perfect. He was just like the rest of us, imperfect and attempting to figure things out. As Kevin began arranging his vacation, I found myself respecting him in ways I never expected. He was taking control of his life by doing what he wanted, rather than what others expected of him. And for the first time, I didn't feel as if I were living in his shadow. The family had finally stopped treating him as if he were untouchable, which seemed like a victory, not just for me, but for both of us. A few days later, my parents arranged a family meeting to discuss Kevin's choice, as well as my recent defiance. I went, but this time, I wouldn't sit quietly. I told them straight up that if they didn't quit comparing me to others, I was going to cut off contact. I was not going to allow them to continue to make me feel inadequate. There was a lot of tension in the room after that, but I wasn't concerned. I had finally uttered everything I needed to say. I left the conference with a peculiar sensation of peace. I had no idea what would happen next with my family, but for the first time, it didn't matter. I was finally living life on my own terms, and it felt great. Update 2. 2 weeks had passed since the family gathering, and I hadn't spoken with my parents. Honestly, the silence seemed like an odd combination of relief and anguish. On the one hand, I was emotionally exhausted by the entire process, but on the other, I finally felt at ease knowing I'd stood my ground. The last thing I told them was clear. If they didn't stop comparing me to Kevin, I was going to terminate communication. It had left them astonished. And the silence. Yeah, they were trying to find out how to reply. In the midst of all that silence, my phone rang. That was my younger sister. She typically avoided family conflict, but this time she called to express her admiration for how I handled things during the meeting. She told me she had also felt the burden of family expectations, but had never been brave enough to speak up. Hearing that was surprising, yet it made sense. She's always been in the background, never making waves, so I guess I never considered that she may be feeling some of the same weight I was. Meanwhile, Kevin was already making moves. I received a message from him stating that he had sold his sports vehicle and was reducing his residence in preparation for his extensive trip plans. The guy didn't waste any time. I couldn't help but be surprised by how quickly he was going, but I had to appreciate it. He was truly taking control of his life and doing things that made him happy, which surprised me. It was bizarre to see him transition from the ideal corporate person to someone who consciously chose to walk away from it all. But the biggest surprise happened a few days later. I was sitting at home, surfing around Reddit, when my phone buzzed again. It was my father. My father isn't one for long chats or dramatic speeches, so when I saw his name come up, I didn't expect much. But when I opened the message, I was floored. It was a quick statement. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." That is it. It was a little message, but coming from him meant a lot. For as long as I could remember, my father had always been the silent sort, never displaying any emotion. So receiving this text from him felt enormous. Of course, not everyone agreed with the way things had gone. One of my aunts called and blatantly tried to guilt-trip me into apologizing to my mother. She went on about how family comes first and how upset my mother was. But this time, I wasn't giving up. I stood firm, telling her that things had to change, and that I would not continue to live under the same weight of expectations. I wasn't being rude, but I was direct. It felt like another tiny win to be able to set boundaries with them, even if they didn't appreciate it. I kept posting Reddit throughout everything, and the support I received from strangers was astounding. Every time I submitted an update, I received comments from folks who had been in similar situations. It felt almost like treatment. Seeing that other individuals knew what I was going through made me feel less alone. It provided me with confirmation that I hadn't had from my own family in years. Then one night during one of our catch-up talks, Kevin smacked me with something unexpected. He suggested I join him on his travels for a few months. He thought it would be a perfect opportunity for both of us to get away from the family stress and simply reset. I wasn't sure how to answer at first. The idea of taking a few months off was appealing, but I had never been the kind to take impromptu travels, especially with someone with such a tangled history. Still, it remained in the back of my mind. A few days later, my parents' silence ended. My mother called, and it was not the angry, demanding call I had anticipated. Instead, she was in tears, pleading with me to come over and talk. She didn't understand why I was furious or angry, and she pleaded with me to make things right before they grew worse. I agreed to meet with her, but this time, I set the terms. I told her I'd come over, but first, we'd have an honest chat about how her incessant comparisons to Kevin had affected me over the years. She pondered before agreeing. When I arrived at the residence, things were tight. My mother was defensive at first, not understanding why I was making such a big deal about things. But as I laid it all out, how the Thanksgiving dinner went, how she always bragged about Kevin's success while never acknowledging mine, it began to set in. I provided her specific examples, demonstrating how the family's fixation on Kevin had made me feel like an afterthought for years. At first, she denied it. She insisted that she simply wanted the best for me, and that she never intended to hurt me. But as the talk progressed, I saw a shift in her. She began to realize how her actions, albeit well-intentioned, had caused significant damage. She apologized, and while I accepted it, I knew it would take time to heal. My father was also present, sitting calmly as he usually does. He didn't say much, but when I mentioned how suffocating their expectations had been, he nodded. That tiny act meant far more than any words could have. It was his way of saying he understood. The meeting concluded on a cautiously hopeful note. My mother stated she was willing to work on things, and my father even promised to attend one of my freelancing art shows, something he had never done before. I left feeling optimistic, but I knew it would take time for things to really change. Later that night, I found myself reflecting on Kevin's offer to go. Perhaps this was the ideal time to take a break from the family conflict and focus on myself. I'd spent years coping with their expectations, and now I had a chance to break away, at least for a short time. I've chosen to go. I texted Kevin and said I'd accompany him on the first leg of his journey. I wasn't sure what to anticipate, but I decided it was time to find out. Update 3. Departure day came quickly. Kevin and I boarded the flight to Japan, our first stop. I'd never traveled much before, so the entire event felt weird. The exhilaration came in waves, accompanied by a small amount of anxiety. There we were, two cousins who had spent most of our lives entangled in family dysfunction, set to embark on this big journey together. Before we departed, we agreed on one thing: no family conversations. This was our opportunity to leave everything behind and simply enjoy the adventure. The first several days in Japan were a jumble of unfamiliar sights, sounds, and foods. We jumped right into sightseeing, temples, busy streets, and neon-lit nights. Kevin appeared calmer than he has in a long time. He wasn't constantly checking his phone or discussing work. I began to see a different side of him, one that was unrelated to his work or his family's expectations. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but it was a noticeable departure from the Kevin I knew. After a long day of touring, we ended up at a quiet supper location and ate bowls of ramen. Kevin finally talked about his choice to quit his work. It wasn't just the stress, he continued. It was the knowledge that he had been living a life controlled by what others desired for him. His parents, his colleagues, and even our extended family. Everything he had done up until now had been for their approval, and he had no idea what he wanted for himself. It hit me harder than I expected, owing to the realization that we were more alike than I had previously assumed. Although our journeys had been different, we both felt shackled by expectations. His is the perfect success story, whereas mine is constantly being compared to that achievement. The more we chatted, the more the barriers between us came down. For the first time, we were having a genuine conversation, rather than the surface-level conversations we'd had at family events. Kevin said that he had always coveted my ability to pursue my passions. He told me that while I might not have the money or prestige, I did have something he lacked: passion. In exchange, I revealed that I had always felt inadequate next to him. It was a real honest chat that brought us closer than ever before. Of course, things were not perfect. A few days later, we had our first major argument. Kevin, being Kevin, wanted to organize every element of our trip, including itineraries, backup plans, and spreadsheets of potential destinations. Meanwhile, I wanted to be more spontaneous, to go with the flow and explore without a set timetable. The conflict was inevitable. We ended up not speaking for the rest of the day because we were both too obstinate to back down. By the next morning, we were both done. We sat down to apologize. Kevin stated that his urge to control every aspect stemmed from his demanding career, where everything had to be perfect. I recognized that my dissatisfaction was not just about the vacation. It was deeper. It was about how I still felt compelled to prove something. We agreed to meet each other halfway. We eventually reached a compromise. Some days, we followed Kevin's ideas, while others, we let the day flow naturally. Once we found our groove, the trip was precisely what I needed. We trekked through the mountains, visited peaceful temples, and even made a surprise weekend vacation to the countryside. The longer we were traveling, the lighter I felt. It was like peeling away layers of anticipation with each new experience. I began to regain my joy, not just in life, but also at work. I even got out my sketchbook for the first time in months to draw scenes from the trip that had inspired me. Throughout, my phone rang with texts from home, largely from my mother. She sent updates on how things were progressing, but I kept my comments brief. I wasn't ready to go back into that environment just yet. Then one day, I received a message from my father. "Hope you're finding what you're looking for." It read brief and straightforward, but it had a lot of weight coming from him. I did not answer immediately, but the message lingered with me. As Kevin and I continued our journey, he began to worry about what he would do when it was all done. He didn't intend to return to corporate law, but he wasn't sure what the next step was. One night, I proposed that he consider consulting or teaching law part-time. For the first time, he appeared open to the notion. It was an odd shift. Kevin, who had always been certain of his path, was now exploring something quite different, but it felt like a positive change. One night, while scrolling through Reddit, I decided to share a reflection on how the trip had affected my outlook. I discussed letting go of the desire for family approval, and how my relationship with Kevin had evolved from rivalry to mutual respect. It felt good to share, and the responses poured in again, full of encouragement and understanding. A few hours later, my mom texted me. She saw the post and told me she was proud of me for following my dreams. It was unexpected, but for the first time, I felt cautiously optimistic about making things right with her. By the end of the journey, I felt more in control of my life than I had in the past. I was no longer defined by familial comparisons, and for the first time, I felt completely confident in myself. Kevin and I parted ways at the airport. He was going to his next trip, while I was returning home. We both had a better knowledge of each other now, which I never imagined would happen. As I returned to my home life, I couldn't help but feel that it was the beginning of something new. My freelancing company was picking up again, and I had some huge ideas. And perhaps there was something else on the horizon, but more on that later. Update 4. Coming home from my trip with Kevin felt different in a way that I couldn't quite understand at first. Everything in my apartment looked smaller, almost as if it couldn't accommodate the new perspective I'd received throughout our travels. But rather than feeling confined or trapped, I felt more in control, as if I suddenly had room to breathe. I felt clear, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't weighed down by familial comparisons or self-doubt. I was eager to get back into life full force. When I went back, the first thing I did was catch up on my freelance job. I hadn't imagined how much going away would refuel my imagination. Within days, new ideas flowed, and I felt more motivated than I had in months. I began working with a few new clients, including a well-known company that I'd been wanting to work with for a while. After finalizing the agreement, I made an update on a freelance site regarding the expansion of my firm. The response was astounding. It wasn't just the upvotes or comments, it was the acknowledgement from individuals who understood the grind, who had watched me rage, and now saw me thrive. As I returned to my normal schedule, my family began to contact me more frequently. My mother called and invited me to supper, and I noticed my father sending the occasional text asking how things were doing at work. They seemed to be trying. And while I admired their efforts, I remained vigilant. I wasn't going to let myself fall back into the toxic comparisons that had governed my life for so long. I eventually accepted my mom's dinner invitation. I was a little nervous, expecting the same old ritual of hearing about Kevin's newest achievements. But to my astonishment, everything was different. She was truly interested in my trip with Kevin, inquiring about the places we went and what the experience was like. For once, the topic wasn't about Kevin's accomplishments or how I measured up to him. It was nearly normal. During supper, my father said something that caught me completely off guard. He stated he was proud of me for making the decision to travel and pursue my interests. It was a simple comment, but coming from him felt significant. My father has never been one for lengthy emotional conversations, so hearing him accept my choices like that was more significant than he probably understood. It was unexpected support, but it strengthened my belief that I was on the right track. As the weeks passed, I noticed a change in the way my family interacted with me. My mother still made the occasional remark about Kevin, but she quickly caught herself and changed the conversation. It wasn't ideal, but it represented development. More significantly, I wasn't allowing it to affect me in the same way it did before. I finally felt in control of how much their comments influenced me. Then, something unexpected occurred. A few weeks after returning home, Stella and I met at a local art event. We had known each other since college, but I had not seen her in years. She was now a photographer, and we instantly connected. over our mutual passion for creative work. We swapped numbers, and before I knew it, we were meeting for coffee later that week. It didn't take long for me to experience something I hadn't felt in a long time, a genuine spark. Around the same time, Kevin called me from Italy. He seemed more cheerful than I had ever heard him. He discussed his trips and the great experiences he'd had. He even said that he had no intention of returning to law. Instead, he was thinking about a passion project he had always wanted to pursue, writing a travel book. Hearing him talk about his future with joy rather than stress was a welcome shift, and I found myself cheering for him wholeheartedly. There was no tension or conflict between us anymore. We were just two people figuring out our own paths. Stella and I hit it off right away after that first coffee date. She was encouraging, positive, and truly interested in my work. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was with someone who accepted me for who I was, rather than comparing me to others. It was invigorating, and the relationship began to progress naturally. We spent more time together. And as I got to know her better, I understood how much she influenced my creativity. When I introduced Stella to my mother, she instantly asked, "What does she do for a living?" Normally, the inquiry would have made me feel compelled to justify or explain myself. But I didn't feel that way this time. I simply informed her that Stella was a photographer, and that I was satisfied with her. My mother must have realized that pushing any further was not going to be successful because she dropped the subject, something that would never have happened previously. A few weeks later, I was presented with another significant opportunity. I was hired by a technology company to manage a design team on a big rebranding. It was the type of job I never imagined I'd be trusted with, and it felt like all of my efforts were finally paying off. I announced the news on an entrepreneurship forum, and the response was phenomenal. I couldn't help but think about how far I had gone from my initial venting post. Speaking of reflection, I published another Reddit post outlining the previous few months and how everything had changed. My relationship with my family, my closeness with Kevin, and my newfound confidence. It all felt like part of a journey that I could finally be proud of. The post went viral, garnering thousands of comments and upvotes from those who had been following along from the start. It was humbling, but also validating, to see how many people connected with my story. Stella had a significant impact on my creativity. Her photography inspired me to try new techniques in my design work, and we began working on little projects together. I felt like my work had gained new depth and purpose since we started dating, and I was excited to see where our cooperation would lead us. I'm now focused on the future. I intend to grow my freelance career, pursue new creative opportunities with Stella, and establish healthy boundaries with my family. I'm not completely healed from the years of comparison, but I'm on the right path. I can feel significant changes coming, and I'm ready for whatever happens next.